Um, as you will see, I will talk a little bit about what's meaning, why is meaning so important in psychology, and then I will show you a case study and sort of try to walk you through how we come to what pulling means in therapy and what is it that we do with meaning, sorry. So as I go through this, feel free to ask questions. Just be mindful to use the Q&A button on your screens. If you like, you can use the chat to talk to each other, but to ask questions specifically for me, use the Q&A option, please, because it's much easier at the end of the presentation to go over the Q&A questions there. As usually quite a number of you ask questions, and then if I scroll through the chat, we're using up the time that I could be answering your questions. There, of course, as usual, no questions that are off limits. I hope to finish with my presentation in about 45 minutes, and then we'll go to the Q&A portion. I say that every time, and then it takes me longer than 45 minutes, but I will really try to make it 45 minutes this time. Okay, so if only the slide would change, I would be able to show it. Okay, so this is what we'll be talking about today. So first, just briefly, I will explain what trichotillomania is for those of you that are here for the first time. Then we'll talk a little bit about what meaning is, and then we'll talk about how to understand meaning and how to discover meaning. And then we'll go on to the case study, and after that, we'll have the Q&A portion as every time. So just briefly, I will not sort of dwell on this too much. So trichotillomania is, simply put, compulsive hair pulling. There are roughly two types. One that starts in the childhood and another one that starts in adolescence. In terms of they are the same, sort of the same issue, but what's different is the prognosis. It turns out that the onset, when trichotillomania starts in adolescence, it tends to be more difficult to treat than childhood onset trichotillomania. Female to male, sorry, someone says, can you hear me? Because I see someone says, is the webinar working? Okay, I'm going to, okay, well, oh, thank you. Can you see, I'm currently on slide number 2. I hope you can see that. Okay, perfect, thank you. So a female to male ratio is 9:1, meaning most of the clients we ever see with hair pulling are female clients. I find that the male clients that struggle with hair pulling are really quite interesting, and I was very tempted to ask one of our former clients if I can present some elements of that case, but then I decided to present a client that is perhaps more representative of the problem that we're dealing with. So trichotillomania may seem rare because it's not often talked about, but it's not that rare when you look at the statistics. It turns out that 0.6 up to 3.4% of the general population have trichotillomania, meaning, or at least its chronic form. So sometimes you may have periods when you will pull, which is not necessarily a lifelong problem, but up to 3.4% of the population suffers from the chronic form of trichotillomania. I don't know how that number sounds to you, but for example, with schizophrenia, that is, sort of much more researched problem. It's about 1%, I believe. So it's quite a common issue. About 1/3 and a little more of all the persons with trichotillomania, they will swallow or chew the hair, sometimes bite off the root of the hair as well. And 1/3 of these, so that would be 1/3 of 1/3, will develop a complication called the bezoar, which is basically when all the hairs that you swallow and chew just jumble together and create a kind of wall or structure in your intestines. Sometimes this even has to be treated surgically. That's about the most radical thing, right, that can happen. Of all the treatment methods that we sort of covered more extensively last month, psychotherapy is the most effective treatment option that we have available today. It's by no means perfect. and it's by no means 100% effective, but it is the best thing that we have so far. So these are the current DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. Um, so it's recurrent pulling with noticeable hair loss. I mean, nothing revolutionary there. There is, before the act of pulling, there is an increasing sense of tension, and then there is relief or gratification after pulling out the hair. I believe to most of you, this should be a familiar experience. Of course, the disturbance should not be accounted for by another medical condition, and it should cause social or other issues with function in terms of sort of social functioning. So that's about as much as I would like to go with this issue. If you have any questions, you can ask, but I think it's much better if we spend our time talking about what the actual topic is rather than just the definition. So I'm going to go over 2 or 3 slides, I believe, telling you a little bit about what meaning is in psychology and why is it that we psychologists like to think and talk about that. So there are a lot of faces here. From left to right, I suppose the gentleman on the left, everyone knows, that's Freud. All these people have very little in common, except for one thing, which is that they all put meaning just squarely in the center of the human experience. I started with Freud for many reasons. Today he's, let's say a controversial figure. People have very strong opinions about Freud, but he's the guy that started it all. Without Freud, I wouldn't have a profession now. The reason why he's so great and so important is that he made this wonderful discovery, which is that if you let people talk, and if you probably know the method of free association, at least by name, they will at some point sort of link all these associations together from the symptom all the way to the cause. So he assumed that there is this connection between something that may have happened in the past with whatever the problem is in the present. Everyone else here, these people really would have disagreed about many, many things. I mean, some of them possibly would have gotten into a physical fight, but they all share this thing in common, which is that everything that we do and everything that we say and every problem that we have has a meaning. And it's that meaning really that makes the problem so important and so troubling. I don't have time to go into details about each and every one of these people, even though they do deserve more attention. So I will focus only on the 2 of them in the end here. The last one is, of course, George Kelly. And if you listen to or watch the previous webinar, you know that I mentioned him. If you were on the one before that, you also know that I mentioned him. So by now it should be obvious that every sentence that I utter will contain Kelly's name, sooner or later. And the person before Kelly is I guess you can say German-American psychiatrist. His name is Paul Václavic. And he's not very well known, but he's very influential. And he has some, I believe, really very intriguing ideas about what symptoms are and why is it that we have them. The person that's in the row below, just standing there all alone, is John Dewey. I put him down there because he's the only philosopher in the crowd. Everyone else was either a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist. And the reason why I put Dewey there is because he too talked about meaning, but through the prism of sort of our experience. And I really like this quote because I think it shows exactly why meaning is so important. He says, in a certain sense, every experience should do something to prepare a person for later experiences of a deeper and more expansive quality, meaning that we use our previous experience to gain more experience. So in order to get new experiences, you have to draw on your old ones. That is the very meaning of growth, continuity, and reconstruction of experience. This will become very important in just a few seconds, but I think what the main thread for me here is that meaning is something that happens through our interaction with the world. So it's not something that, consciously or unconsciously we come up with and then just stick to. It's something that just emerges from the place where we were born, from the events that took place around us, the events that we had to deal with, the events that we chose to deal with. So all this shapes our experience. And then this experience gives us tools to act in the world further. So that's why meaning is so important, because it allows us to act. It allows us to interact with people. It allows us to adapt to certain situations, and it allows us to alter our environment. And by environment, I mean both people and actual inorganic environment. So meaning is actually like a tool. That's maybe the best way to look at it. I think often when I talk about meaning, people have this kind of abstract and almost mystical idea in mind, but essentially it is a tool. I will explain just now how the tool works. I'll start with Kelly. So his basic assumption in the way that he builds his psychology is that every person is like a scientist. So Kelly himself was a scientist, and he wasn't a psychologist; he was an engineer. So he had a very scientific way of thinking, and he thought that scientific thinking is not really just the privilege of scientists. I mean, yes, they have the degrees, and yes, they have the official titles, but the process that scientists go through when they test their hypotheses in the lab, for example, is, according to Kelly, exactly the same thing that we do every day. He said that every behavior that we adopt is a kind of hypothesis. So basically the whole world is our lab. That's what he would say. So we create some sort of an assumption about an event. Then we encounter the event, we do whatever it is that we think we should do, and then afterwards we evaluate how successful it was. If it gave us what we had hoped that it would, we just keep using the same type of behavior in similar situations. So to give you an example, if let's say when I do therapy with people, so sometimes I will have an assumption about what may be important for their problem. I will check it with them. I will ask, or I will suggest something in one way or another, and then I will get feedback. They will say, no, you're wrong, or, well, I tried this yesterday, it didn't work. And in that case, I know that my hypothesis is not true. So in order to be a good scientist, I have to reject it and come up with another one. And the same thing goes with people. So if you go and approach someone with the idea that if you're kind, you will be able to establish a relationship with that person. You approach in whatever way you imagine is kind, or whatever is kind to you or your environment. And then if the reaction of that person is what you would perceive as sort of being interested in you, you will consider your kindness hypothesis confirmed. If not, you will have to go back and figure out another one. Once you validate a hypothesis, it sort of becomes a part of your lived experience, and you just keep using it. So most of this happens unconsciously. I don't think, well, I'm sure that Kelly didn't think that. I don't think anyone actually does it, which is to verbalize every single thing. So most of the decisions that we make and most of the hypotheses that we test are not really very easily accessible to words. We can't really articulate them very clearly. However, for Kelly, that is the process that takes place regardless of how much of it we can put into words. So according to this, a symptom is also a hypothesis. So if you look at, for example, hair pulling, that could also be considered a hypothesis. In that case, we have to then ask ourselves, so what is it that we hope to achieve with this? And do we really achieve this? So it has to have meaning because it comes from our experience. And our experience comes from previous situations and previous problems that we've solved. And then sometimes a hypothesis will have a very high price. I'm going to just briefly sort of skip over to Paul Václavic because that's just how my mind just worked, which is that the way he talks about meaning is that it's always sort of a double-edged blade, so to speak, because for him, every solution that we come up with, so every hypothesis that solves a problem for us, also poses a problem on another level. To give you a practical example, so let's say you have arthritis, and you have to take, like Tylenol, or not Tylenol, maybe ibuprofen, or one of the non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. So what can happen? You have to take them so that you would have less joint pain, right? But then if you take them over, a period of a few years, you might end up having gastritis. So what solved your arthritis on one level caused another problem on another level, which is that now you have stomach problems. So the solution is also at the same time a problem. If we look at hair pulling, and I'm going to just sort of grossly generalize here for a second. Very frequently, hair pulling has to do with anxiety. So when you feel anxious in certain situations, and then you don't know how to cope with that anxiety or how to understand it and what to do with it, you may, through whatever series of steps, come up with hair pulling as a solution. But hair pulling, as we all know, and the reason why we're all here, is a problem in itself. It's a problem that affects your self-confidence. It's a problem that affects your, I'm sorry, there's something here, okay. So it's a, sorry. So it's a problem that, it's a solution that actually generates more problems going forward. I really like this idea because it shows that sort of nothing in our psyche comes without a sort of trade-off, in a sense. There are no universally good or universally bad solutions in psychology. There are just sustainable or non-sustainable solutions. Those that have a good, let's say, cost-benefit ratio. So let's just summarize this and then move on to another topic. So because they come from our experiences, symptoms always have a meaning. Sometimes the solutions that they offer come with a high price. Obviously, hair pulling being an example. Sometimes symptoms can arise because we're being very bad scientists. So when Kelly sort of started thinking about people through this lens of them being scientists, that means that, you know, he had to conclude that sometimes we are bad scientists. That means that sometimes we keep using certain hypotheses even though they don't really work. We sometimes like to either just flat out ignore the evidence that it doesn't work, or sometimes we just like to sort of play around with numbers and statistics and pretend that it works for a while. I believe there's that quote that was attributed to Einstein, but he never said it, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again but expecting different results. I think that's a good way to think about what a bad scientist might be, according to Kelly. And then there's this last thing, which I didn't mention, but I will now, which is that symptoms can sometimes be a mode of communication. So for hair pulling, it's difficult for me to come up with a very clear example for this. But think of it as a form of nonverbal communication. Maybe it's not the most relevant thing for hair pulling, but I just felt it was important to mention it. For example, I remember a client that I had many years ago who had panic attacks. And so as we worked through therapy, this was a very important line of thinking because panic attacks were her way of communicating that she needs certain things from people, from her husband, from her family, because she was, at least in her eyes, this extremely independent, self-sufficient person, and she couldn't really simply allow to say to people, look, I need you to take care of me in this way, because that way she would kind of alter the way she sees herself. But then panic attacks were a kind of communication. Although it was a message that people couldn't decipher, but nonetheless in therapy, it was very important to be able to see it as a line of communication, because then we could find a more appropriate line of communication, for this way. I hope I didn't give you too much theory and too much sort of abstract stuff. Let's just look at this in very practical terms. When you start therapy, for example, or start simply thinking about yourself, so how do you go about discovering what something means? Before I go over this quote, I would just like to say one thing, which is when I talk about meaning and when I talk about sort of symptoms having meaning, people will come to me or email me or ask me in some other way, so how do I discover what my meaning is? I don't think it works quite so simply and elegantly as the theory suggests. The reason for that is that a symptom can have multiple meanings. In fact, the more a symptom is present, the more layers of meaning it gets. And that's why I like to use the term excavating, because it really is like archaeology of sorts. you sort of discover one layer, and then another layer presents itself. Then you deal with that layer. Then you sort of patiently peel them all until nothing is left eventually. But it's very important to know that there are usually layers of meaning. And then on the other hand, meaning is not very stable. If you think about it, when you test hypotheses, for example, you test them with people. People change, societies change, cultures change, our circumstances change, which means that eventually our meaning evolves as well. So even when we discover a layer of meaning, it doesn't mean that it's the most important one or that it's the currently operating one, if that makes sense. So just to go back to the topic, which is how do we discover what something means? Kelly suggests two things here. He says, first, that it would be useful to see the man in the perspective of centuries instead of just, he says, in the flicker of passing moments, meaning that if you want to understand someone's behavior, it's not sufficient to just look at that person. So when someone comes and tells you that they have a problem, you can't just say, oh yeah, sure, that's what this problem means. Because the problem that the person is talking about, so hair pulling in this instance, only makes sense in the context of that person's life story. And a person's life story, to make things more complicated, is not just their life story. And here's why. So you can have, we all have our, let's say, personal path that we walk down. We shape our path with the choices that we make. But then our starting positions are not always the same. We're not born at the same time. We're not born in the same part of the town. We're not born in the same class, race, gender, age, culture, just you name it. There's so many sort of forces that shape the choices that we will have that will eventually then be reflected in the meaning that we give to events. So you can't just look at a person and assume what it means. You have to sort of carefully unfold their life story and see the history of the choices that they've made and the options that they had. And then Kelly says that's one layer. And then another important layer is that no one really makes decisions in a systematic and carefully thought out way. I know that some of you may say, well, I do. I would also say that most of the time, but that's just because some people have a tendency, like me, for example, to sit down and think through some of the choices that they're making and try to figure out what's best for them. But I don't do that for every decision that I make. When you go to the store, you take one item but not the other. Sometimes you will make a decision, just passing by somewhere. We don't think through all our decisions because we can't really predict all the events that are coming our way. So sometimes in the moment, we have to just pick up something from our experience that resembles the situation that we're facing and apply that lesson. Take some of our old hypotheses and just throw them onto a situation. So Kelly says that when you look at these 2 points, which is what happens in the moment and what shaped the way you see that moment, that's where you can find a good solid ground to understand what something means and how to restructure that. I hope that was clear. I tried to make it more, at least to me, this is more logical, so I hope it makes sense for you as well. I tried to arrange it a little bit so that we can see more clearly what paths you can take in and out of therapy, of course, to understand what something means. So if we look at hair pulling, since this is obviously what we're dealing with, if we look at hair pulling, then we can start with the passing centuries that Kelly says and explore the past. So if you come to therapy, you will likely start from that point. You will tell your therapist what the problem is that you want to work on, and then what you will immediately do is talk about how the problem came to be. So you will discuss, if it's hair pulling, how did you first start pulling your hair? What was happening in your life then? How did you feel about it? How did you even figure out that pulling is a problem? How did it change over time? As I mentioned before, meaning changes over time, which means that symptoms also fluctuate over time. So was it always the same? Was it becoming only worse? Was it oscillating? Were there periods when it was present or absent? Were there periods when you were able to stop and then periods when you started again? So all these layers can help you uncover some, let's say, some basic stuff about what it means. But that will never give you the full picture. So we need to go back to the childhood and explore our past, but that's only one half of the picture. The other half is what's happening right now. So when you start therapy, that means that you're usually on the edge of something. It's a transformative moment to just think about going to therapy. So if you think about how many years you've been pulling, some people pull for a few months and immediately decide to start therapy. Other people will pull for 10, 20 or more years, and only then will they consider psychotherapy. Right. So sometimes it's because they didn't consider it a problem, sometimes because they could hide it easily, sometimes because, well, sometimes there's so much shame attached to pulling. So it's very, very difficult to face the problem, to say it out loud, to tell someone what's bothering you. So that's one moment to explore. Why am I ready to change now? And am I ready to change now? Then another thing about the present moment that you can ask yourself is, so what are my triggers currently? What doesn't trigger me? In fact, what calms me down? And then you just sort of arrange these two and compare and contrast and see what is it about triggering events that seems similar and what's so different about the events that actually help you and calm you down or dissolve the urge, for example. Another thing that you can look at is how triggers change and evolve over time, because something that may have been a trigger for pulling 5 years ago doesn't have to be a trigger anymore. So that can also change. And then there's another aspect of the present moment thing, which is the moment-to-moment experience as you pull. This is usually quite important, but also quite difficult for people. So what I mean by the moment-to-moment experience is when you look at what happens just before you pull, as you pull, and after you pull. What do you think, and what do you feel, and what's happening around you, and what was happening just before? So what are the thoughts that you're having? Are they thoughts, or maybe are they images? Like, what is it that you associate pull? How does it feel to pull? How does your body feel? How does your mind feel? So this kind of phenomenological approach is quite important, because it can tell us a lot about which aspects of pulling are the important ones. So I don't know, of course, I mean, there's so many of you present, I can't even assume how specifically the situation is for you, but for some people, for example, unless they bite off or chew the, unless they bite off the bulb of the root of the hair, or if they don't chew the hair, or if they don't look at the hair, the process of pulling is not equally satisfying. So it's also, when you analyze this moment-to-moment experience, you can sort of really zoom into that part which is crucial for you. Because if you look at it, pulling seems so simple, like your hand just goes up, pulls the hair, and that's it. But actually, there's much more to that. There's so much happening inside of you, around you, and even the process itself, as I mentioned just a second ago, can be divided into several stages. So you have to zoom in really carefully and figure out which stage is the most important one for you. Now, there's also exploring solutions. I put this because, again, I even marked it with this bizarre shape, because I think this is a very neglected thing. People, when they say, okay, so I need to figure out what pulling means, their idea is, well, let's figure out what it means first, and then go and find a solution for that. I don't think that's the most effective approach, at least not in my experience. I feel like the best way to work is to work on both lanes at the same time. One, to understand what's happening and what does it mean to pull. And then another lane would be how to have more control over it, let's say, or how to stop it altogether. And the reason for this is that sometimes we can find a solution by just sort of trying different techniques that work for most people. And then as we talk about the solution and why the solution is the solution for you, we can also understand some of the meaning as well. And then there's also this special case, which is all the way in the lower left corner, which is exploring resistance. Maybe this will sound familiar to you, but sometimes you will find something that's, let's say, good replacement behavior for pulling. And you will use it for 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week. And then suddenly one day you will think, well, I don't have to use this competing response today or this time. I'll just use it tomorrow. And then next thing you know, you really develop a kind of resistance to using competing responses. Sometimes you can actually feel it as resistance when you feel the urge to pull, and then you know that you're supposed to, I don't know, use a worry stone or take a squeeze toy or whatever your competing responses might be. And sometimes you will really think like, oh, I really don't want to use a competing response right now. And then sometimes it will be a more subtle form of resistance, which is, I'll just pull one hair, or I'm lazy, or I don't feel motivated to use a competing response. All these are basically resistances. Those are little moments when you know that you have a solution for your problem, at least currently, and you choose not to use it. We don't experientially, no one, or rarely do we have that moment where you say, okay, so I'm just not going to use this and I will pull. But that is the choice that is being made very frequently. And these sort of moments are very precious. Usually when I work with people who struggle with hair pulling, they will tell me how frustrating that is and how upset they are with themselves for not using a competing response. But on my part, I always see that as an opportunity to learn something really quite important. If you remember previously when I was talking about what symptoms mean, I said that they perform a function, so they do something, they're useful. And these moments when you choose to pull, and of course choose again, I have to sort of mention it, not necessarily consciously. So these moments when you choose to pull are also the moments, instead of applying a competing response, are also those moments where the usefulness is the most important. Like it's extremely important that you use pulling as a tool. That's where it's most applicable. In fact, it's so useful that it's more important than the damage you will make or the guilt that you will feel or the shame that it will cause. So that's actually the moment when you fail to apply a technique to help yourself. That's also a prime teaching moment, like a great learning experience, because that's when you can learn in that moment what was the meaning of the symptom. Why is it that of all the things that I could have done, pulling was the best one? I know it sounds a little unusual to talk about pulling as being the best solution for everything, but in that moment, of all the things that you could have done, that was a solution for something. So that's a direct experiential connection to what I was talking about before. I'm not going to read these quotes that I put. They all more or less talk about investigating experience. And the last one, I guess I like the most, which is that failure is instructive. And this is something that I have a very hard time conveying to my clients often, which is that first of all, progress is never linear. I in 10 years of being a therapist, I have never, I think, seen a client who recovers without experiencing setbacks on the way. That's just not the way humans work. Our hypotheses are really not all that good in the beginning, and then as you move on and learn more and sort of make them more precise and sophisticated, you become better and better and better. And this is why I think failure, as difficult as it is, it's also extremely important to understand and study and analyze and really deconstruct well, because that's the way that you grow as a good scientist. I'm just going to stop here briefly to show you how sometimes meaning works in unexpected ways and how we link things that we're not even aware of. I was talking about meaning in another webinar recently, I suppose. And so I decided to use a few verses from William Blake's Auguries of Innocence, especially this to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, because I think that really very nicely illustrates what I'm talking about when I talk about discovering meaning. You're supposed to take in just as an ordinary movement, which is your hand sort of reaching your hair, and then see a whole world of meaning in it. It's no longer just a movement. It's a coping mechanism. It's a reminder of something. It's a message to someone. It can be all kinds of things, right? So you can't just see a grain of sand. You have to see a whole world in it. And then, as I was talking about this, it suddenly occurred to me how I actually got the idea, although not consciously, to create this slide. was a really an interesting moment for me. So to see a world in a grain of sand, the first time I heard those lyrics, those verses, I'm sorry, um, was when well, I was quite young at the time. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was when The Silence of the Lambs came out. If any one of you has seen that movie, maybe you remember that there is a moment where Anthony Hopkins is reciting these verses. I think he recites that Robin Redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage to terrify Jodie Foster on the other side. And so why am I mentioning this? Is when I was making this slide, I was thinking, okay, so you have a few verses, but you really need to add something to that slide. So I put a picture of William Blake, the one that I liked, and then I thought, this is still very empty. And then I thought, oh, Red Dragon, just put Red Dragon there. And then I did, as you can see it on the left. And then as I was talking, it occurred to me how I actually came to the idea of using Red Dragon. So I learned about William Blake, as you now know, from The Silence of the Lambs, and Red Dragon is one of the is a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs, also a movie was made later on. And this image specifically plays a very important role in the movie. I don't want to spoil the movie for those of you who haven't seen it, but that's exactly where I saw Red Dragon. It was in that movie. And so the whole Hannibal Lecter franchise is indirectly responsible for this. So this, of course, doesn't bear any heavy psychological meaning for you, but it does show you how sometimes we connect things without having any conscious awareness of it whatsoever. And it was really an accident, I think, that I remember this when I was talking about it. So that's exactly how meaning operates. None of that was conscious. Actually, I had to hide my happiness at the time because I didn't want to sound half crazy because of how excited I was to have made this connection. And this is the way that our psyche operates every day, including when we pull. And this is why understanding what happens in your mind and in your body when you pull or just before you pull is so important, because that gives you these little pieces that help you assemble a whole chain of associations that in the end sort of give you the meaning. So for this to stay practical, I'm going to give you an example from my practice. It's going to be a client who went through the TrichStop program, and prior to this, I contacted this client and asked for permission to share some details. So everything you can see here is something that she agreed to share with you. So it was a 29-year-old female client. She worked in a small gallery. I put curator, but she was really everything from a caterer to an accountant. She did everything. It was a very, very small gallery. She began pulling when she was about 16 and has been pulling on and off ever since. So that was at the point when we started working together, that was about 13 years of pulling. A year and a half, well, I put ago, but it was a year and a half before she started the program, she got engaged and she wanted to stop pulling by the time she gets married. So she basically came with a timeline for change. However, from the very beginning of our work, it kind of became obvious that she is really very reluctant to engage in therapy. So she would check in, she would write things, but it would seem a little detached to me. And, you would ask someone 5 questions and you would get 3 no, 1 maybe, and 1 yes as an answer. And all these questions could have been essays. And then I asked at one point really very clearly, so if you are not willing to work or if you don't feel like answering any of my questions, I mean, maybe this is simply not the right time for you to make this change or sort of start the program. And then she shared that she's really very ambivalent about it, that she was pushed to take the program by her fiance, but she wasn't really sure if she wanted to go through it. She could see that pulling was a problem, but. And that was a very important but. So during the first week of the program, we immediately encountered resistance. This is not very common, I have to say, because usually when people sign up, they have a lot of enthusiasm to work, so they will write and be very engaged. And then we encounter resistance by week 3 when we start habit reversal training. But for the first 2 weeks, people usually write and they're very happy to answer any questions or share anything. But here it was like from week one, immediately. Hello, this is me, I'm resisting this. And then, so sometimes she would come and then write about how difficult it is, but then she would also, by the end of the message that she would leave me, she would start saying things, but at the same time, I just pull 1 or 2 hairs at a time, and I don't even pull every day, and I don't have any bald spots right now, and it doesn't really hurt to pull, so it's not that big of a problem. So it was really up and down in terms of accepting that she has a problem and also being willing to address the problem and engage with it. So when I asked and said, so do you really want to be in the program? And is this even the topic you want to address? Because once people start dealing with pulling, we often go into different directions and talk about unrelated topics because our lives don't really take place in a vacuum. So there's always something else happening that directly or indirectly affects pulling. So I said, okay, you subscribe to the program, then let's at least see if we can work on something so that you don't waste your time and your money. And then she slightly sort of started changing the way she approached it. And then we started talking whether or not she's changing for herself or for other people. And that she wasn't really sure. Even though she did consider pulling a problem, she wasn't sure if change was something that came authentically from her, or is this just something that she does to please her fiance at the time. And this is where I think our real first step took place, because then she started telling me a little more about her life and sort of how she saw her life in the direction it was taking and some pressures that came along. So as you can see, I'm putting all kinds of artwork everywhere. Artwork is very important for this, but the artwork that I will show later, this is just me putting stuff that I like. These 2 paintings, for example, the top one is by Lee Krasner and the lower one is by Jackson Pollock. She was his wife, and during her life, she was known as Mrs. Pollock, but she was a really very talented painter in her own right. If you ever have a chance to see any of her work, I highly recommend it. So she told me about basically that her work is her life, and that she's extremely ambitious and that she has very high goals for herself. She said at one point that she doesn't really want to sell expensive paintings, so she doesn't want to, to work in an auction house and sell all these paintings that are sold for, $25 million or something. But rather, she wants to sort of influence the way art is seen and perceived. She wants to be like the person behind the curtains who discovers new artists and changes the scene itself. Parallel to working in a gallery, she was also working on her PhD, and it was also something related to contemporary painting. She wanted to start a family as soon as she gets married, but at the same time, she also didn't. So she really did want to be a mother, and she really did love her husband, but she felt that work and her ambitions at work, as they were at the time, were already too much for her, and that starting another project that is that big, such as having a baby, would put an almost impossible burden on her shoulders. And she also wasn't willing to give up either of those. At the time when we were starting to discuss this, it wasn't really very clear why, but then later on, I think it became clearer. And also there was this interesting tidbit that her husband was in more or less the same field as she was, and there was a degree of professional rivalry between the two of them. So then, as the program moved on, we analyzed some of her triggers. The reason why if you feel like I'm jumping from one point to another, you will see this as I present the case, because this is more or less how our conversations went. I really didn't want to assemble this in one cute story that has a beginning, middle, and an end, because therapy is a meandering process. So I just wanted to show how it works directly. So to go back to the point, analyze certain triggers. So when you start the TrickStop program, what you do for the first 2 weeks at least is something we call self-monitoring with the app that the people in the company made. And then we use that material to extract and learn about your triggers, among other things. We talked about other stuff as well, but this is what proved fruitful. So I'm just going to focus on that, not to give you too much unnecessary information. So this first column here on the left is a list of all the triggers that, or at least most of the triggers that she identified as being important. I'm not going to read all of them, but just if you have, just pay attention to how unusual they are. So there's like too much work and then there's no work. And they're both triggers. There's not doing enough or not doing well enough. So there's like more of everything and less of everything. So being bored, for example, is a trigger, but at the same time, reading a book is a trigger. Too much work is a trigger, but also having too much free time is a trigger. And this seemed sort of quite paradoxical to me. So I listed all these triggers, and I asked her if she can group them together and see if they have something in common, because there was quite a lot of them. And it seemed logical to assume that there would be some themes repeating themselves. And so she sort of classified them in 4 groups. They were, I'm not doing something I should be doing. I'm not doing things well enough. I'm failing. And I'm not who I should be. So I asked her if these 4 share something in common. And she said, well, yes, of course. The clear thing in common is that I'm just not good enough in any of these situations. So maybe she's not failing spectacularly, but she's really not good enough. So she's failing some important standard every time. And then I asked, okay, if you're not good enough in any of these situations, when are you good enough? And her answer was something that I remember reading it. I thought it made me very sad. It was, when I'm perfect, I guess. Which means that even when she achieves perfection, however one does that, she's still not sure that that's enough. So even perfection was not enough. And I think this is maybe the point where our therapy really started making sense, and where she realized that she really does have something at stake and something worth working on. So in order to have a full picture, I decided to ask about periods when she doesn't pull, because her pulling was very on and off. And even if you don't have periods when you don't pull, you very likely don't pull 24 hours a day. So there are things that you do that you don't pull. And then we focused on these things a little bit. And so these are some of the things that she listed. Having a beer somewhere, taking art classes. When she traveled to Colombia, she spent one summer in Italy. When she goes browsing through galleries, which was something that was both work and pleasure for her. Reading romance novels, which she immensely enjoyed. Being in the subway alone, being around people. She wouldn't really ever pull around other people. And then in the time that it takes for her to wake up and get out of bed until the point when she starts checking her emails. That was also one period when she would never pull. And then I did the same thing as I did when we talked about triggers. And I said, well, are there some common themes here? And she says that it's all really one thing, but she really couldn't explain it. Like, it was very hard to put one word to describe all these situations. And so I said, well, if it's a mood, can you describe the mood? If it's a feeling, can you describe the feeling? So I just tried to see if there are some associations that she can give me. And she said, oh, yes, of course I can give you associations. I have a painting for this. And I said, excellent, send me the painting. Sadly, she didn't buy me a bigger splash by David Hockney, although I would have appreciated that corruption. I'm just kidding. And also it's in a private collection. So, but so this is the painting that she sent me. And so I asked, so what is it about this painting that sort of gathers all these diverse elements together? And she said, well, it's just one of those relaxing moments when nothing is happening and you don't have to do anything. And then she gave me some more associations, like how she imagines the furniture to be in that house, and how the whole style, the way it was painted, the colors that were chosen. For her, it all means you're fine. Like, there's nothing to do and there's no place to go. Paraphrase Buddha, I believe. So that was the first part. And I thought, okay, so we have something that's the opposite of being perfect is good enough, I guess. Because these are moments that are really, there's no perfection to be achieved when you're alone in the subway or when you read romance novels. In fact, when she was describing all these situations, she would sort of frequently mention how pointless they are, useless they are. I will talk about this a little later. So none of this was good for her, let's say, conscious mind. However, the image was very beautiful and she liked it very much. And the condition that she describes is also rather relaxing and peaceful. So I asked if she can find the opposite of that. So if this is not pulling, what's pulling if you would represent it visually as a painting? Just bear in mind that this might not be the approach that works for everyone, and that some people would probably have different elements and different ways of symbolizing. But I thought this client would be good to represent because we can all see paintings and descriptions would not be, I think, as interesting for you. So this is what she chose as the side where everything's perfect and where you have to be perfect. Just take one moment and just look at that painting. It's a painting that I really didn't know about until then, by Lucian Freud. Just look at the desperation in her eyes. It's such a beautiful piece of art, but also I think conveys quite a difficult emotion. So on the left side, with this rather depressing looking painting, that's perfection. That's being good at what you do. That's being very ambitious. That's having a PhD. That's discovering new artists. Everything that she loves is that. And then all the situations when she's doing nothing useful is a bigger splash. And I think for me, this was such an impactful moment when I saw this because it seemed completely the opposite of what one might expect. Like you would expect someone who's so career driven and who really truly enjoys their work not to represent themselves the way this painting is, right? So needless to say, my client also sort of saw this very glaring, obvious example of something being very, very wrong about perfection and the course that she's taking in life, if this is how she sees herself pursuing that. And on the other hand, if these situations when you're wasting your time by drinking beer is this beautiful image on the right. Again, meandering to a different direction, but we will come back to that. Is that we, at week 3, we started habit reversal techniques. At this point, I would also like to say that this therapy took a little longer than the 8 weeks that the typical program takes. Because initially when the client first, so when I say week 1 or week 3, that's what formally it should have been. But in the case of this client, that was maybe after a month. Then we started using habit reversal techniques. So she selected certain competing responses and stimulus control techniques. But then something very unusual and paradoxical even happened, which is that she started experiencing a worsening of her symptoms instead of improvement. So she had what she thought were good and accessible and easy to use competing responses, but her condition was actually getting worse, not better. And then we talked about that and we reconstructed this cycle that further on led us to talk about what it means to be perfect. So the urge to pull for her was a culmination of anxiety that would sort of gradually accumulate in her body. I like to incorporate mindfulness in my work, and mindfulness is a part of the program itself, but I like to usually emphasize it from the very beginning. And she could quickly notice that she was doing a specific type of mindfulness called body scanning, that she's very tense. And that this tension sort of keeps getting worse and worse and worse until one day, a few times a week, it would escalate and become an urge to pull, or she would pull. So she would notice this anxiety and she would feel the urge to pull. And she would know that now is the right time to apply a competing response. Then she would start thinking that maybe she won't be able to successfully apply the competing response, that she might fail. And then the fear would sort of add more to the anxiety that she would already feel, and then therefore intensifying the urge. And then, of course, when the fear grows to a certain point, she actually would fail to apply a competing response, meaning that her fear would come true because of the way it would make her feel, not because it was inevitable. But then every time when she would fail, she would say something to herself along the lines of, "What is wrong with you?" I also have to say that this is a very censored version of what she wrote in that moment. It was sort of filled with other words that I don't think I would like to share. But it was a very angry, upset reaction at herself. She would berate herself for failing, and then that would kind of generate more anxiety, and then more urge to pull, and then more fear of failing, and then more failing, and then more anxiety, and then on and on and on and on. So here, I think if there was any doubt at all that perfectionism is what we should be talking about, I think after this point, there was no doubt at all. Because for this client, it was her expectation that she would be 100% successful and 100% compliant is what actually caused her to have more symptoms rather than less. And then this was also a very important point of conversation. What does she mean when she says, what is wrong with you? Because as a therapist and as a person, I really do think we're allowed to fail from time to time. There are very few mistakes that we cannot correct or amend in some way. I mean, very few things in life are irreversible. So from my point of view, there's no, okay, you failed, but that's sort of a learning experience. It's not necessarily a reason to be upset with yourself. But for my client, that was the only option. The only viable option was to discipline herself even further. Going back to the paintings. As we were discussing her obstacles to sort of using competing responses, which is usually something that's quite effective for people and it works quite well. And sometimes actually that's all that people want from the program is competing responses. And then when they have symptoms under control, they feel sort of like they've gotten what they asked for. So we went back to exploring what it means to be perfect. And so I marked here in red some of the things that were bad about that specific side. So when it comes to being perfect, there's the slight side effect on the quotation marks, which is pulling. Then there's the fact that you're always chasing something and you're never really resting. Because if you're aiming for perfection, then you never really achieve it, right? The upside is that you can feel good about what you do and you can feel safe and you can be socially acceptable and socially presentable. And that means that you will be loved and that people will see you as a responsible grown-up. But at the same time, it also means that you're under constant pressure to perform and that you're always anxious. And because you're so hyper-focused on these things where you need to excel, you really miss out on a lot of things that might otherwise be pleasant for you or even necessary. On the other hand, if you live like you're inside of a David Hockney painting, you don't pull, you don't have a lot of anxiety. There's really more than enough time for everything because you're not in a hurry to go anywhere. You can enjoy the smallest things. One of the exercises that I suggested for her, and it may sound silly to you, but it really was very useful, which is to imagine herself inside that painting and what would she do? And then her answer was, well, of course I would be just looking at other people or the sky or the palm trees and just drink beer or read or just stare at the sky and do nothing. But at the same time, doing that makes you a bum. You're not productive. You're not really very caring as a person. And you don't really even care that you're not productive. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything. You're basically a social outcast. You're a do-nothing. You're not a relationship material. You're not lovable. You're probably jobless because all you're doing is just drinking beer and looking at the sky. So you're not a very you're not a very lovable or acceptable human being. So you can see how the combination, like these two categories are sort of both bad and good at the same time. Like, yes, we all want to be successful and socially acceptable and loved, but that comes at a very expensive price. If you remember, one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning was that sometimes symptoms are the price that we pay for certain solutions. Like they're hypotheses that just cost us too much. And for this client, a lot of how she would see herself would come from the validation that she would get. She really did truly enjoy art, but what she would strive for in everyday life was not so much to enjoy art, but to satisfy the criteria that she thought other people held her too. So she would, when she does something, when she selects a new artist, she would make sure that he's a good artist, but that's not where she would get her validation from. It was supposed to be recognized by specific people, and her PhD was supposed to be liked by certain people. So there was a lot of directedness towards others. That's when she sort of started talking about the program as something she started to please her fiance. So it was about being acceptable and lovable to him. Having children, for example, one of the reasons why she had such a hard time thinking about family was because it was very hard for her to discern whether or not she wants that for herself, or is it something that she's doing to be socially acceptable and loved. On the other hand, if you sort of go for the other needs that you have for which there's no place when you're perfect, like enjoying being alone or enjoying small things in life or just enjoying art or doing nothing or relaxing, well, then you're not lovable, because you're only lovable if you're perfect and if you're acceptable and responsible and grown up. So it was a very difficult position that she was in. It's a very sort of oppressive way of thinking about yourself. Then we went back to what's wrong with you from that cycle that I put it here as well, in case you forgot. So, because that what is wrong with you, to me, exemplified very well how she related to herself. The anger, the resentment, the frustration with never being good enough. She discussed that part of the pulling cycle with me as being the dark side or the side effect of her perfectionism. So you either do things with 100% efficiency or you just don't bother at all. So when you apply a competing response, either apply it every time or don't even apply it once. And it turns out that she was really not able to forgive herself, even for the smallest mistakes that she would make. So what is wrong with you was both sort of an act of aggression towards herself, but also a sign of how unforgiving she was. There was simply no room for error. And sometimes for her, pulling was not just a way to channel the anxiety of having to be perfect, but it was also a way for her to express the anger that she felt. It was a way to punish herself, in a sense, for failing to be good enough. Pulling would also be the opposite of forgiveness. Forgiveness would be learning a lesson and moving on and trying to do better next time, whereas pulling is what is wrong with you. That's what it meant to her. So at this point, we both agree that perfectionism is something that we must address somehow. Of course, I think she didn't, and I certainly didn't have the illusion that perfectionism is something you can resolve in a few weeks of therapy, but it was certainly enough to create at least a theoretical idea on how she can approach it, and then try to implement something together to give her good foundations so that she can keep working on it herself. And one notion that I try to introduce in our work together is that perfectionism is a really good ideal to have, but it's not a goal that we can hope to achieve. So that she doesn't have to discard the image of perfectionism that she has, because it's obviously a very important image. And even though it's quite oppressive and difficult because it's unachievable, it also did give her a lot in life. So she managed to be very successful at her job. She managed to be a good student. She developed a network of colleagues and friends. And so her life was good in part thanks to that perfectionism. So I quoted this man with what is an unpronounceable name for me, Alfred Korzybski or something like that. I'm sorry if I butchered it. This is a quote from one of his books. He says, "A map is not the territory it represents, but if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness." And I think this is a very good way to relate to perfectionism, which is that it is a map. It's an image that you can try to emulate or go towards, but it's not something that you can actually achieve. And so it's not an image that you have to lose. It's perfectly okay to have it. It's just about how you relate to the perfectionism. So we discussed what's useful and what's motivating in her perfectionism and what's really hindering her. and what is the oppressive and difficult and problematic aspect of her perfectionism. And as she would try to implement this and try to see her perfectionism as being something that's really inherently unattainable, that's where she would get more space to make mistakes, to try out different things. Because she was no longer a failure at life if she didn't do something perfectly. She was simply sort of a person trying to find the best way to approach her ideal. This sounds very elegant, maybe when I say it, but it's not that easy to put into practice, and it really did take a lot of hard work. So this is where I again reintroduced mindfulness, but a sort of special flavor of mindfulness. Usually, when I work with people, I will try to find a type of mindfulness that works best for them. For most people, it's body scanning or maybe loving kindness, or for most, I think, just mindfulness of the breath. But with this client, we talked about using forgiveness and implementing forgiveness as a formal meditation practice along with mindfulness. She started doing mindfulness daily. And first we started with body scans, and then we proceeded to introduce elements of forgiveness, but very slowly and very gently, because even though rationally she could see why forgiveness was an important concept to introduce, because then you wouldn't have the what's wrong with you moment, and instead she could simply move on and learn, and then actually approach her ideal much faster. There was a lot of resistance to that. Some of the feedback that I would get from her, and just I think when I use forgiveness or something in that sort of flavor, more emotion oriented mindfulness, people will often feel resistance or just overwhelming sadness or even disgust sometimes. So I try to introduce it gently with exercises that are not more than 5 to 10 minutes long, and then every week, if it's possible, we agree for her to do it a little longer and a little longer. We also heavily relied on informal mindfulness practices, which is basically, so formal mindfulness is when you sit and meditate for a certain number of minutes or hours. And informal mindfulness is when you sort of infuse mindfulness in other activities. So because she was so busy and because her life was so hectic, we thought that it might be very useful for her to do certain things mindfully. So part of her daily job was to look at artwork. And then the way she would approach artwork was with an eye of an art critic, which may be sharp and may be very perceptive, but it's most certainly not the most emotional and the most mindful eye in the world. So to begin with, she started implementing informal mindfulness when she would look at art. So before she would start to cut it up with whatever theoretical tools she had, she would sort of try to see how her body would react to the artwork. Like, what is the experience of looking at art? So I don't think this is an activity that I would suggest for most people, because I don't know how much time per day you spend contemplating art. I certainly don't have the time, but if you do, well, that's one way to work. And that's one way that she can develop mindfulness of the body and awareness. And then when she would start analyzing the artwork, that's when what's wrong with you attitude would slowly play in. And when she would approach it more mindfully, she would be able to see how it operates. In the beginning, of course, it's very hard to change that. But just when you recognize, okay, so now I'm just going to judge myself, you create a little bit of a distance between you and the judgment. So when she would say, okay, what's wrong with you is coming, and then when what's wrong with you phrase comes, she would sort of know how to deal with it when she would be able to anticipate it, because she would be able to predict it. And so later on, we developed different strategies how to talk back to that what's wrong with you voice, what to do when the voice is active. I'm using the voice metaphorically, of course. And that was one other way that we approached perfectionism, through mindfulness. And as our work together was sort of slowly coming to an end, since this was a client that really liked structure and order, we decided to create a map, a kind of instruction sheet on what she should be working on in the future, and what are some ways that she can progress with her mindfulness practice, and how to avoid her barriers and resistances and things like that. Because that way, when she finished the program, she wasn't really on her own. She had something that she can work with and something to build on. And also something that would sort of avoid her what's wrong with you mechanism, because you have a path, you don't improvise. And so this is an overview of our work together, because every week in TrickStop, you take an assessment form, and then you can create sort of a path of how your progress went. So as you can see, her symptoms were quite intense, because on the scale that we use, 100 is the highest that you can score, and her score was initially above 60. So that's quite a lot. And this is, for example, why I could tell in the beginning that when she would say, oh, it's not a big deal, I just pull 1 or 2 hairs from time to time, I could tell that that's her sort of dismissing the gravity of the problem, because when you have a score above 60, that's not exactly sporadic pulling. 15 is sporadic pulling, but not 60. Then at week 2, after she had 1 week of self-monitoring and sort of bringing in more awareness of pulling, her score expectedly slightly reduced. But then at week 3, when we introduced habit reversal techniques, it spiked. That's when it was almost as bad as it was in the beginning. And this is actually not entirely unusual. So most of the time when people go through the program or any psychotherapy, there are ups and downs, but ups are not usually in session 3. That's actually one of the places where people tend to make progress, because you start using very tangible, practical techniques. So this is where she had her little relapse at session 3, and that's when we actually started talking about perfectionism and her need to be 100% efficient at everything she does. And as you can see, once we started talking about perfectionism, her score initially reduced, then stagnated a little bit, and then reduced again. That was the period when we explored what was the David Hockney painting, and then what was the opposite of the Hockney painting, which is the Lucian Freud painting. And then here is when we talked about what's the difference between the map and the territory, and then finally when we slowly introduced informal mindfulness and forgiveness. And at the end of the program, as you can see, her score wasn't 0. It was something about 10. Well, let's say about 14, I suppose. When I was creating the chart, I had the exact scores, but I forgot the numbers. It's something between 10 and 20. I also really wanted to show this because I think it's very important for therapists to set proper expectations. I think absolutely that anyone can stop pulling. I just think it's important to see a real life example that after 8 sessions, you're likely to extremely reduce your pulling, because if you compare her session 8 score with her session 1 score, that's a very significant reduction. From above 60 to under 20 is a huge change, but it was still work to be done. So she did achieve really tremendous progress, but it did not entirely resolve her pulling. She did have the tools, and she continued to work on that. I think this is really important to show, because I think as a person and as a therapist, I'm very skeptical of anyone who promises 100% success rate after 2 months. It does happen, but it doesn't happen for everyone, and I think that's very important to point out from the very beginning. So I'm going to stop here and then start seeing your questions. I see that you've sent quite a number of them.